I should get started. My name is Jamil Anderlini. I'm the Regional Director for Politico in Europe. So I oversee Politico in this part of the world. My topic today is Disrupted Politics, Resilient Media, Sustainable Journalism in a Polarized World. So I'm going to talk about a bit about politics and a bit about media. And I plan to give a very optimistic view of media, because I think a lot of you have probably heard a lot of pessimism, a lot of sadness in our industry, and I actually don't feel like that at all. So genuinely, I'm going to be optimistic and very positive. But I'm going to start with a little story. Since I'm a journalist for 25 years, I'm a storyteller, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about my story. And my story is that I am a true child of globalization. I am the living embodiment of globalization, and my story begins about 40 minutes from here in the town of Gualdo Tadino, which was where my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother were born. So I'm actually from Perugia, the province of Perugia, and I'm from the town Gualdo Tadino. And in the late 19th century, a time of war, a time of disruption and poverty, and there was a giant earthquake actually as well around the same time, my great-grandparents left in their early 20s. They left Perugia and they got on a boat and they went to Ellis Island and they went to the United States. And they ended up in Kansas, Frontenac, Kansas, as coal miners, my great-grandfather. And my grandfather was born in Kansas, and then they moved to San Francisco. My father was born in San Francisco. Now, my mother, her family were from Scotland, from the Highlands, Ullapool. They were the Clan MacLeod, and some of them. And the others were, they were called Trevarthen, and they were from Cornwall. So literally the two opposite ends of the British Isles. And they moved to New Zealand in around 1830, 1840, 1850, around then. So half of my family left here, literally here, and moved to America and ended up in San Francisco. And the other half of my family left the British Isles and ended up in New Zealand. So that's early globalization. Then my father is a marine biologist. He was working in on the Swahili coast in East Africa, and my mother was a hippie, and she was traveling through Africa, and they met in a post office in Malindi in Kenya. I was conceived on the island of Lamu, so romantic, and I was born in Kuwait, Kuwait City, Kuwait. And so that's why my name is Jamil, and my surname is Anderlini. Anderlini is actually a very unusual Italian surname, but it is very common around here. So interestingly, 3 weeks ago, so a couple of people in the audience have actually heard this story last night because I told it to them, but 3 weeks ago I got an email from the Gualdo Tadino News. And the Gualdo Tadino News, these wonderful journalists there, I think really fantastic journalists, because they were able to dig me up. They said, we see Dr. Anderlini, of course, doctor, wonderful. I'm not a doctor, but Dr. Anderlini, we see that you're speaking at the Perugia International Journalism Festival, and we are wondering, since your surname is quite rare in Italy, but it's very common in our town, if maybe you are from our town. And we should mention, there is another prominent American, also from our town. His name is Anthony Scaramucci, the Mooch. I don't know if any of you know about the Mooch. Some of you know about the Mooch. He was the communications director for Donald Trump in his first term for 11 days before he was fired. And his most famous line is, this town, I'm from New York. He's actually from Gualdo Tadino, but I'm from New York. These people in Washington, they are all backstabbers. I'm a front stabber. So I get this email, and they tell me that Anthony Scaramucci is an honorary citizen now of Gualdo Tadino. And I'm thinking, I'm more respectable than the Mooch. If you're watching Mooch, I'm more respectable than the Mooch. So maybe I'm going to get honorary citizenship. And so yesterday, I went and met with the mayor of Gualdo Tadino here in Perugia, because he happens to be also the president of the province of Perugia, it was the most moving and amazing thing for me. We met in the palace down the road, and they gave me my family tree, which I had no idea about, going back to 1540. A copy of my family tree and a little certificate saying, we're very proud of our son of Gualdo Tadino, but not honorary citizenship, which I'm a little bit, but they said, if I come to Gualdo Tadino, then maybe I will get it then. So I'm very excited. Anyway, so I grew up in the Middle East. I started school in Muscat in Oman. That's where I started primary school. And when I was 8 years old, we moved to New Zealand. And when I was 22, I moved to China. And I lived in China from the age of 22 to the age of 44. And I married a Chinese woman, and I have 3 half-Chinese children who are quarter Gualdo Tadino, Italian, quarter New Zealand, MacLeod, Scottish, whatever. So they are the real products of globalization. I'm on the way to that. I say all this to point out that the last 3-4 decades, since basically the fall of the Berlin Wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been the high watermark of globalization. We've obviously, as you can tell from my background, had periods of globalization in the past. They were mostly about colonizations, more colonization than globalization. But the last 3-4 decades has really been the high watermark, the greatest moment of globalization in history of humanity. I have been a journalist now, as I said, for 25 years. That period of most of our lifetime has been the most stable, the most peaceful. We've obviously had some wars, but it's been incredibly peaceful, incredibly stable, and incredibly prosperous. More people have been lifted out of absolute poverty, many of them in China, where I was living, than ever in history, and it is an incredible achievement by humanity, I would argue. But that period is over, totally over. And you've seen it in the last couple of weeks, but you've actually seen it in the last 5 or 10 years. Globalization, the thing that produced me, and my children especially, is done. And we have to come to terms with that, and we have to understand that this is a new reality we're dealing with. So for the 15 years of my career, I worked for the Financial Times. And this period, since like around 1990 till around 5 or so years ago, was really the period of globalization and also the period of financialization, GDPization of everything. It didn't matter if you were a dictator in Beijing or a KGB agent in Moscow or a Democrat in Washington, D.C., or a dentist in Switzerland. You had to understand markets, and you had to understand globalization, GDP. It really, politics was in some ways almost irrelevant. It was all about the market, free markets, global free trade, globalization. If you didn't understand that, you couldn't really be in politics. And I would argue that era ended about 5, maybe a little longer ago, 5 years ago, and we've entered the era of politicization of everything. And since I am a trendsetter and a vanguard, I believe, I like to think I am, I went from the Financial Times, which was very relevant in the period of financialization of everything, to the Politico, which is very relevant in the era of politicization of everything. That means now, if you're a CEO, if you are a company director, if you are it doesn't matter what you are, if you don't understand what's happening in politics, if you don't understand what's happening in geopolitics, you are going to lose money. In the same way that if you were a politician who didn't understand how markets worked, you weren't going to be a politician for very much longer. So it used to be that we'd say, it's the economy, stupid, and now it's politics, baby. So it's all different, and deglobalization is happening, and it is accelerating. Actually, I would argue, very interestingly, this is happening at the same time that media is globalizing. Media has, for the first time, in a way that it never has before, is now, you can write a story in Brussels and it can be read in Antarctica instantaneously in a way that was totally impossible. If you think about the model of journalism that I entered when I started as a journalist, it was metropolitan. There were only a couple of global newspapers. Most newspapers, as we think of newspapers, were metropolitan daily newspapers, they didn't go much beyond the city limits, maybe a little bit out to the countryside around, but you could exist as the Chicago Tribune or the, whatever it is, the Sacramento Bee or whatever, in your little market. If you could do journalism, and that is completely broken down. Those don't exist. The only survival mechanism for those daily metropolitan newspapers is to try to be more relevant, either go hyper local or be relevant beyond just their city limits, and compete then with the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times. Very, very difficult thing to do. Now, I said I was going to be optimistic, and so I'm going to just say that I truly believe that we are at the beginning of the golden age, the dawn of the golden age of journalism. I really, really believe that. And why do I believe that? So the internet that has wiped out newspapers, basically, has wiped out many of the traditional media that some of us grew up in, or some of you read about on the internet now. It is very similar, in my opinion. I'm not saying anything very revelatory, but I've thought about this a lot. It's very, very similar to the invention of the printing press in around 1440. And if you think about what the invention of the printing press led to, a lot of good things and really a lot of terrible, terrible things. I don't know, we're sitting in a Catholic place, so from the perspective of the Catholic Church, pretty terrible. Martin Luther, pretty bad guy, came up with Protestantism. But from the perspective of Protestants, I have some Protestants in my family, really wonderful. We came up with the true word of God. Shouldn't be saying this with these guys looking down on me, but so if you think about what happened, there is a direct, in my opinion, a direct line between the invention of the printing press and the Protestant Reformation. The ability of the Protestant church to use the vernacular, to use printing and pamphlets. I mean, the famous Martin Luther nailed his pamphlet on the door in Wittenberg. I mean, this is like extremely important. Without the printing press, you would not have, in my opinion, Henry VIII being able to chop off all the heads of all his wives, and et cetera, et cetera. So what happened? The actual message, it was the Bible we're talking about mostly, the actual message of the Bible didn't really change. You could have it in different languages, but the delivery mechanism changed, and it revolutionized everything. And then messages changed, et cetera. That's what the internet, to me, is, but on steroids. And what you are seeing, in my opinion, is not a change in the way that print text journalists do their job. So I actually, having run newsrooms, having been a reporter, frontline reporter for many years, I actually don't believe that the act of text-based journalism has changed at all for 150 years. Today, the way that I would go out and interview somebody, get some information, write it down, the language is a little bit different, but not that different. The inverted pyramid of, journalism school, what I'm talking about. All of that is exactly the same. What's different is the way that we disseminate that on your phone or on your laptop or through the internet. And what's really changed is the business model and the way that you charge for this and the way that you get people to fund this. And that's what's broken down. So the delivery mechanism has exploded into the most incredible democratizing force, but the business models have not kept up, except at places like Politico, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So I actually believe, and I've talked to a lot of very esteemed colleagues who agree with me, that we have never seen more excellent journalism than we do today. There has never been more wonderful, amazing, vibrant journalism, people finding out things that people don't want you to know about, than there is right now. But the business of our industry has been in deep crisis for several decades, a couple of decades already. If you think about the way that the traditional big newspapers and big media companies worked, they are very much like the high priests of the Catholic Church, copying out the Bible by hand and disseminating it only to people they wanted to see it and only the messages they want to see, and then giving it to people, specific people to read it from the pulpit. That is very, very similar, in my opinion, to the way that media worked in the 20th century, right? That the editor-in-chief of the New York Times gets to control what millions of people read in the morning in America, or at that time in America and around the world. It's very, very similar, and I think what the internet is doing is disrupting the high priesthood of journalism. Some of you are in the room. I certainly worked for some of the high church of, I don't want to get into which church the Financial Times is, or the Guardian, or whatever, but like, let's just say, oh, they're the Quakers for sure, by the way, the Guardian. But anyway, so the point is, the internet, like the printing press, has completely disrupted our priesthood, and we have to come to terms with it, and we have to understand it, and we have to work out how we adapt to it, and also how we are going to make what we do sustainable economically. And if you work for one of the big legacy media, some of them have worked out some of how they're going to survive, and others are struggling. But because they're struggling, what is happening is many individual journalists who see the opportunity and get fed up with proposing to their bosses different things, they go off and start their own media, and they can do it like you could if you were Martin Luther or Calvin, or, you can go through the list. They can go off and they can start Puck, or I don't want to name too many of them, but you know what I'm saying. You can go and start a newsletter. There's a guy who I was reading for a while, I'm not going to name him, but he went off, he was working for a giant media organization, doing a newsletter, and he said, you know what, I'm just going to do my own. And so he went off and started his own. Now he's hired someone, and he's like building an audience. It's kind of amazing what you can do. Politico did exactly that. So about 18 years ago, the political editor of the Washington Post and a star journalist, his name was John Harris, he was the political editor for the Washington Post, and a star journalist called Jim Vanderhei, they left the Washington Post and they started Politico. They hired about 30, 40, 35 people at the beginning. They chose the best journalists they liked, and their whole point was, look, the Washington Post has the sports section and the business section and the metropolitan section and the culture section, the arts section, but we just know about politics and we just care about politics, so we're just going to do politics, and we're going to do it online. They had a print and still have a print publication, but we're going to do it online, and we're just going to be fast, we're going to break scoops, and we're not going to talk to people like the Catholic Church. And we're not going to talk to people, talk down to them and talk to them in sort of code and riddles. We're going to talk to them like how journalists talk to each other at the end of the day, once they file this story, when they meet in the pub. They write the story about, a very serious topic, and then they go, oh my God, did you see John Kerry, and did you see like blah, 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 whatever? Like, they talk to each other like humans, and so that was part of the idea. We're going to talk to people in an urgent way. We're going to tell them the thing that everyone is actually talking about, but the journalists don't necessarily write about. So that was 18 years ago, and then 10 years ago, this month, they launched a similar model. They said, this is working really well in Washington, D.C. We think Brussels, it could work in Brussels. And you know what everyone in Brussels said? No way, can't work. That's an American thing. We're much more serious in Brussels. We can't do that. And we now have 110 journalists in Brussels. We are by far the biggest newsroom on like a massive, just no competition. The second biggest newsroom in Brussels is actually, I'm reliably told, Xinhua News. Xinhua is the state propaganda wire service of the Chinese state. Since I'm being live streamed, I'll just pick my words carefully, but traditionally, let's just say traditionally, Xinhua journalists are not always traditional journalists. They have a multifunctional role to gather information for certain departments of the Chinese Communist Party who oversees security, like the KGB. So I'm not saying anything about individual journalists. I'm just saying traditionally in history, Xinhua has served a different role from what we think of as traditional journalism. Just saying. So there's never been greater journalism. I would say if you look at Politico, we are by far the biggest biggest success of the digital generation of publications that started around the time of around late 2000s, early 2010s. If you look at our contemporaries, publications like Vice, like Huffington Post, like BuzzFeed, like Vox, we are by far the most successful of that generation of publications. And we've done it, I don't want to give away all our secrets, but we've done it by focusing on what we do well, by focusing on the audience we're trying to reach, by focusing on a clever business model, and we have been incredibly successful. And I would just say that it is one model. It's not the model that's going to save journalism. We are just one model. And to get back to my optimism, my great optimism, yes, the Reformation brought war and strife and polarization and all the things we actually are seeing, I would argue, a little bit today, but it also brought the most fantastic flowering of intellectual and endeavor, literacy, that we could, that we could ever imagine. Right now, I would say that the linear television journalism model is where print journalism was 20, 25 years ago. So I believe very strongly that there is an enormous opportunity to come up with the business model, because I actually think that the journalism on television, the broadcast journalism that people do today, and what they will do in the future will be similarly to text-based journalism, will not change very much, actually. The actual act of being on the spot, interviewing people, putting together a 3-minute package or a 5-minute or a documentary, I actually don't think that, which is, I think, very, very successful, the model of how the journalism is done and how it's, the people on camera, et cetera, I don't think that's going to change very much, but the business model is in deep, deep, deep crisis. Much more serious in some ways than print was, because the costs are much higher, the profits have been traditionally much higher, and 25 million for an anchor a year, that's unbelievable, and that is gone. Those days are over. They might come back one day, but those days for now are completely over. If I was a young person, I see lots of young people in this room, if I was a young person starting out in journalism today, I would think very hard about how I was going to create the CNN of the future, the business model and the delivery mechanism. How do you do it? How do you disrupt those high priests of television journalism? How do you become the Martin Luther, the Calvin, whatever, of television journalism? If I was young, if I was in my 20s or 30s, I would be thinking very hard about how I do that. Because that, to me, is there are many, many, many opportunities, but to me, that is the biggest and most exciting and most interesting opportunity. So I'm going to stop there. I think I've got, what have I got? 5 minutes? 2 minutes, oh my God. One question, 2 questions, please. Microphone for the live stream, yeah. 2 minutes, my God.
So you just ended on the business model. We've also been talking about the polarization, but how would you, when starting a new television thing, combat that polarization? Well, we've talked about money and stuff, but how would you then do that if you start new?
One of the things I'm proudest of, one of the reasons I joined Politico, is because we are totally nonpartisan. So I would argue that the one way many media have tried to save their business model is by doubling down on polarization. They know that if they can make people angry and they can make people upset and hate somebody else, that they can get them hooked on the crack that is polarization of politics. And I just think it's not the greatest service to humanity, personally. I'm quite respectful of some of the media that have built very successful business models around this polarization model. I personally, having spent my whole adult life in an authoritarian, trending, totalitarian state, People's Republic of China, I am a deep believer in democracy, and I also, having lived the last 6 years of the time I was in China, I was the Asia editor of the Financial Times. I was based in Hong Kong, and I personally covered the Hong Kong protests of 2019 and the introduction of the national security law in 2020. And I personally saw how fragile democracy is and how easy it is to crush overnight, basically overnight. And I think that our democracies all over the world are incredibly fragile, actually much more fragile than anyone believes. And one of the reasons for it is polarizing media. So personally, I would say it's very, very difficult to be nonpartisan as an individual. I don't believe in that. I actually think we all have our, I personally am a little bit biased towards the Communist Party of China, since they were quite mean to me when I lived there as a journalist. And so I would say that in my publication, Politico, as the editor-in-chief until a few months ago, I tried very hard to find reporters in my newsroom who were very pro the Communist Party of China to balance my ideas, because I do believe at the institutional level, you can reach a level of nonpartisanship. I think it's extremely difficult at the individual level, and I think it is achievable at the institutional level. But it takes a very conscious effort to find people from differing backgrounds. Without naming individuals or going too deep into the debates, the topic of Israel and Palestine is obviously a very, very, very hot topic. And I was fortunate enough in my newsroom to have people from very different ends of that argument, people who'd lived in Gaza and lived in the West Bank, and people who were from Israel in my newsroom, and people who were from America who were very pro-Israel, even more pro-Israel than some of the Israeli people. And I was able, through, at the institutional level, I believe, to do as close a good job of being nonpartisan and fact-based and neutral on such an emotive topic, such a difficult topic, because I had those individuals with those differing views, and we had open discussion in the newsroom. We had very respectful, very important, inside the newsroom, respectful discussions on the most difficult topics. And so I feel that's really, really important. And I feel that the pendulum swings. You get the pendulum swinging to one end where, everything goes polarization, and then audiences turn away. They want to go back to fact-based, non-partisan journalism, and that's where I think we're headed in the next few years. And that's where Politico is very well positioned. And if you're going to start a media company, I urge you to follow our lead. I've run out of time, I think, so thank you very much.